Okay. Okay, well, thanks for doing the show. How should I address you? Should I Stelios or doctor or?
Stelios is easier, I think.
That's fantastic. Well, you know, this is the first time we've streamed one of these shows, and normally we kind of do this confusing thing where we spend some time talking to our interviewees. And we cut it and we put it at the end, and then we actually talk about the subject at hand, which in this case is your book. We'll start off talking about you, and then we'll talk about the book. Is basically kind of the order of ceremonies. How did you find me? It's rather a self-serving question to start off asking.
I don't remember, to be honest with you.
It's just a LinkedIn thing, and you sent me your book.
I speak to so many people. I speak to so many people that I've like I lose track sometimes. But yeah, around my book, I'm basically sharing thing is gonna find it interesting. And it's really a conversation starter, you know, because it represents my, let's say, it's a very good example of the work I've done over the last few years. And I think if anyone's interested in data science, they're probably gonna like this book, right?
Yeah.
So it's really a good way to strike a conversation with other people who want to talk more about AI and this kind of topics.
It's a fascinating book, and I've been literally wallowing in it. So I've got loads and loads of questions to ask you about it. But I do want to ask you a few questions about you to start off with. So you're in the UK now. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. I live in London. Yeah.
But you grew up in Cyprus, it looks like.
No, Greece.
In Greece. Oh, okay. I don't know why I thought it was Cyprus.
Maybe because I'm an adjunct lecturer at the University of Limassol. Maybe that's why.
Okay.
It's on my website and it's on my CV. Yeah, sometimes I teach there. Also, some of my business partners are located in Cyprus, but my base is London.
Okay. I think we have something in common in that we've migrated. I don't know about you, but I grew up in England. You've ended up in England. I'm now here in San Diego. But I remember as a kid, as a 10-year-old, looking up at these planes flying over, because I was near London, and I kind of imagined them going over to the States, and I always wanted to come here. But, you know, I love England. So at what point did you decide you wanted to live and work in England?
Oh, so I actually came here for my studies. I did my master's in the University of Edinburgh in AI. And just before I finished my master's, I received a scholarship at the University College London for a PhD. So I was like, why not, you know? And then I just came here just because of the PhD, really. I didn't know anyone when I first moved here. But then after my PhD, I kind of stuck around, you know. Since then, I've been involved in many, many different things. I'm still doing some university work with UCL, with London Business School, with Cambridge University recently. But I'm mostly focused on supporting startups, small to medium enterprises for data science, and you know, in many different ways, from designing algorithms to writing software.
I don't know how you fit everything in. I was trying to count academic qualifications you have. It's like 6, isn't it? You've got a PhD, you've got umpteen degrees, psychology, computer science. How do you do it?
Yeah, actually, I was dreaming of becoming a cognitive scientist, and I wanted to stay in academia, but then my life took a turn when I realized that I was not very happy with academia, and I just wanted to. I mean, somehow I felt that academia has an impact in the world, but in most cases that's false, and it's quite slow paced. So this is when I figured out that I was basically building out this career as an academic, but then I wanted to do something else. And I jumped ship and moved into the industry. I'm still affiliated with some institutions, still doing, but it's like 10% of my work is university work, you know. So yeah, I'm not sure how I fit in everything together. I guess maybe that's why today I didn't even have time to find a shirt to wear for the interview.
Well, that's fine.
You know?
We're very casual, so we're not going to hold that against you. I was fascinated in your PhD thesis on soccer injuries. I have to say soccer because I'm in the United States. If I say football, everyone's going to get the wrong impression. But so you work with Tottenham Hotspur Spurs on soccer injuries. How did you end up with that brilliant idea, and how did you persuade them to work with you?
So it was quite interesting because at that point in time, there was some awareness in the world of sports of what data science is and what it can do. And I was actually offered a scholarship to study this very thing. And I guess the team wanted to do this through a scholarship because through a university, because they didn't really know where to start, right? So it was like a research project at that time. And because this is what a PhD is. So it was interesting because sports at that time, they were behind 10 to 15 years in terms of the technology they're using compared to other sectors, which were way more mature in data science. And yeah, it was interesting partly because I got to work a lot with many different stakeholders at that time. It made me realize how important culture is within an organization. Because we did many things, but the most important thing, I guess, was the culture change that was required to take place within the team. The reason being that as a PhD, you have to publish some innovative research and you have to do new things and blah blah blah. But at the same time, when you work with under a sponsor, when you work with an industrial sponsor, you also have to keep the sponsor happy. And I realized that at least at the beginning, it wasn't so much about using sophisticated methods. It was more about building, setting up the foundation, the groundwork for what was to come. And this, actually, my PhD years inspired some of my later work, which has been around data strategy and data management and explaining data science to decision makers. Because it's really, if you want to use data science, you need to start from the basics, and it's not always the algorithms.
Yeah, I thought it was. I noticed in your book you maybe leveraged some of that experience, and you were talking about the conflict of interest between the different stakeholders. You have the coaches that want to get the players back on the field, and you have the doctors that are trying to make sure that the players get well. How does that play out? What are the challenges that misalignment presents in terms of the club and your work as a data scientist?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question because one of the challenges was that we had to lose lots of time to understand what the data meant in each case. And my work as a data scientist, I realized it's not always about data science, So it was more than, simply just getting a data set and then working with it. It was much more complicated in a sense because you had to involve the human factor and politics in there. And I quickly found out that these problems, they repeat themselves in other sectors. Maybe not in the same context because sports is, competitive by definition. But you do see these kind of issues like politics and misconceptions around data. So yeah, this made me realize early on that data science is not necessarily about data in the real world.
But how does that conflict of interest manifest itself in the data that you were looking at, or issues in the data that you're looking at? The conflict between the coach and the medical practitioners.
Yeah, so the medical practitioner had an incentive to make the injuries look more severe than they are when they were being recorded, and the coach was trying to do the opposite and put players back into play, which means that the suggested recovery times and the actual recovery times were not were not pure in a sense, if you know what I mean. Which means if you try to train a model on data that's not um, that's it's been labeled by human experts. Okay, it's been labeled by human experts, and the experts that didn't really use their true judgment. Then you can't be sure as to what you're modeling exactly.
Right.
So in this scenario where we're talking about medicine and doctors and physiology, and there's not going to be 100% agreement even between experts. The ideal scenario would be to have 3, 4, 5 experts give an estimate, give their opinion, and then average this. Yeah, but here we had a very different dynamic.
Yeah, I get it. So so your thesis is published online, but I'd be fascinated to get a kind of a summary from you on can you predict reliably sports injuries using data science, and what were the kind of lessons learned? How did you even how do you do it? It's an impossible task. There's a lot of questions there.
It looks like if you have the right kinds of data. Yeah, it looks like if you have the right kinds of data, you can predict overuse injuries to some extent, because overuse injuries, they follow certain patterns. That's one. And secondly, overuse injuries, they also you can, like, as you record data, this can manifest, the injuries can manifest themselves in many ways, but sometimes, even if you don't record, even if you only record, let's say, training sessions, you can still get some predictive power out of the relationship between the volume of the sessions over time and the probability of injury. So it's 100% doable, but if we're talking about more acute injuries, that's obviously nearly impossible, right? So we focused on overuse injuries, which is a common problem in professional sport. Like athletes, they push themselves too much.
Yeah, and I think you use GPS. Is that true?
Yeah, some GPS units which now are no longer in existence. It was called Viper, and then it was acquired by another company, I think. Or is it still around? I'm not 100% sure, because like there was at that point in time there was like an explosion of devices for sports. If I remember going to conferences, there was like a very big trend, and then I think a few of these like merged, others shut down. But the idea is that you wear like a device around your chest, and then this can record using GPS many different metrics. Yeah, I don't think Viper GPS for sports exists anymore.
Oh, I'm sure they're putting sensors all over the place on athletes. But it's to me, one of the takeaways, which is kind of obvious when you think about it, is that people get injured when they're tired. They get tired when they're moving around. So was there some kind of correlation between length of play, exertion, and injuries? Or
yeah, absolutely, of course.
Yeah.
That's common sense. So you expect to find this there. Something else that's interesting is that some of the best players, they just don't get injured that much. That's something else which many people don't realize, and that's actually for all sports. That the people who don't get injured much, they can just train longer, train harder, participate in more games, get more experience. So it's not just that. Sometimes they're good simply because they don't get injured. So maybe part of being talented is also not really being very resilient against.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating. Malcolm Gladwell, in one of his books, I don't know whether you read this one, but he talks about the correlation between the month that athletes are born and their success. And it turns out if you go to school, you're older, the difference between an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 10-year-old is really significant. And so they tend to get picked more, so they get more experience, and so they get better. And it's this kind of virtuous cycle, and you get your 10,000 hours and you become an expert because of that. But what you're saying, I think, is equally fascinating, which is actually a key competence for athletes, is avoiding getting injured, because you get more, not just, obviously no one wants to get injured, but it's not worth being brave because you get less playing time. Amazing. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Part this sort of segment of the show where we actually talk to the experts, and I always find it fascinating. I end up talking to CEOs and leaders in companies, and it's really interesting to hear a bit about them personally. But you know, our way into that was talking about music and the 3 songs that you would take on a trip to Mars. I don't know if you've had a chance to think about that, but first of all, is music important to you? Is that a key part of your life?
Yeah, I listen to music all the time.
Very good.
All the time. I really like music. I mean, I listen to music when I work as well. And I also like play the piano, and I used to compose music as a hobby, but I don't have much time these days, so I've given up on it.
Ah, very good. And did you play classically, or were you kind of more contemporary stuff?
Classical, but also classical and jazz piano. Yeah.
All right. And so I've given you this really challenging task, which is choosing 3 songs take on a very long trip to Mars. What would those 3 songs be if you had to choose just 3?
Yeah, that was a tough question. I didn't know what to choose. I'm like, probably I'm going to give you an answer now. Tomorrow I might give you a different one. But I'd say, I mean, I would probably choose Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which doesn't classify as a song, but yeah, I'm just going to put him there. Then maybe, thanks. Then maybe I would choose something by the Doors, like probably something like Riders on the Storm. And then I was starting to think of electronic track, because I hear a lot of electronic music when I work, which this can mean pretty much anything. And I'd say something which is like not electronic, but it's like instrumental. It's a very interesting band. It's like Kong by Bonobo. It's basically my favorite song to listen to when I wake up. It just wakes me up. Do you know this song?
I don't know it. No, I know the Doors, obviously the Doors song, but why did you choose that one?
Yeah, it's just a great song to listen to as soon as you wake up. Like literally, it's like coffee. Can I share a link here? Can I share?
Yeah, send us the link afterwards, and we for the recorded version of this, we actually play the music. So you don't have to do it now, but. Okay. So with the Doors, I was just wondering if there was some correlation between a time in your life or an incident or anything. But is there any associations with the Doors, music of the Doors?
Not necessarily, but I think it's one of those bands which is like very special. Like when people can find something in the Doors in one way or another, like in either part of their lives or. I don't know. It's one of those bands which I like to revisit every now and then. So maybe I don't listen to the Doors for a year. Then suddenly I just listen only to the Doors for like 2 weeks for some reason. So I can't really explain it. I think also Nirvana are a lot like that for me, and the whole grunge scene, which doesn't exist anymore. But many of the songs from that scene are classics.
Yeah, I got into the Doors after Apocalypse Now. I think it was the end in there. It was amazing. Very good. Very good. Well, thanks for sharing a bit about your life, a bit about the music. Now it's time for me to welcome everyone to the Mr. Beacon podcast. This week we have Dr. Stelios Kampakis. I'm probably, like many British people, didn't do your name full justice, but Doctor, thank you very much for joining us. And we're here to talk about your book. It just came out with a 2nd edition, The Decision Maker's Guide to Data Science. Thanks very much for joining us to talk about your book.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, why is it that decision makers should care about data science?
Well, I think data science and AI are very important topics because, I mean, they're just play larger and larger roles in our lives. Okay, I think this is clear. If you see graphs around the investment in AI, whether it's like startups or funds spent by governments, in many different ways, you'll see that this is just a trend that keeps going up and up and up and up. I think in 2019, the AI startups received about $30 billion in funding, and this is going higher and higher. And we're also really witnessing an AI arms race by the strongest countries in the world. And obviously, this doesn't leave any industry unaffected. This doesn't leave any company unaffected. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about small companies, big companies. It's there. It's something that it's there. And sooner or later, like pretty much, like it's like social media, right? So people, when they first exposed to social media, you get some early adopters, and now every company needs to be on social media because there's so many people there. It's a bit like this with AI. It's just that it can provide an unfair advantage to any company that's using it the right way. So sooner or later, you have to care.
Yeah, I was talking to my boss, the CEO of Wiliot, about the fact that you were coming on the show, and he's based in Israel, amazing entrepreneur, really has done an amazing job of many things, but including getting funding for our company, have some great investors. And he pointed out that in Israel, which is kind of this incredible powerhouse in terms of startups, that data science is the hot topic. It's the kind of one of the most sought after skills. But can you point to companies where data science has been, a significant factor in their success? The kind of the world leaders out there.
I mean, there are countless examples, right? Depends on the industry. One of the earliest examples in the United Kingdom, where I live, was Tesco's, where they started using analytics. Like all the other supermarket chains had to also do so because they were just so successful in using analytics. And this was like the early days of these club cards and all that stuff, which now it's a given, right? If you're talking about sports, I guess the most famous example is Oakland A's, the whole approach of Moneyball. So that's another like
great movie.
Famous.
Great movie.
Yeah, exactly. Great movie, and totally, and great actors as well. And so these are some, let's say, prominent examples. But then it really comes down to the industry. I guess the most impressive examples are, but the most impressive, like the examples that people will resonate most closely with, will be things like Netflix, Amazon. Every time you're using a service like this, you see a recommender system, right? It's also Google, Facebook. Like everything in there has been chosen by AI. It's not like all the content is created by AI. Then again, this might not be as flashy cases, and that's one thing that AI data science, they can improve efficiency in many ways, but it's not always as impressive as seeing a robot, for example. Robots are pretty impressive, but AI is a bit like let's say operating systems. It's super useful. But it's cool only if you're a geek, really, or if you're a data scientist.
Yeah.
Most people just see the end result, and over the years, we take it as a given that Amazon's delivery works really well, and we don't even think how much AI is involved in the whole supply chain and robotic process automation and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of reminds me of the life of Brian. What have the Romans done for us? And I think about, well, what has data science done for companies? And then you look at, well, apart from Google and Facebook and Netflix, and I was just trying to think whether Apple is data science critical to Apple. I guess they have Siri. That's probably not the center of their success. But would you say that data science has been helpful to them?
Well, Apple, it has Siri. I know it's investing. I know it is investing heavily in AI, but it's behind in the AI arms race, because it has this mentality that everything needs to be closed, and like ever has realized that it's not how it works, because it's such a difficult problem trying to replicate human intelligence. And I think it has only recently started to publish some research. It's very secretive. Um,
Yeah.
so I think it's, if you compare it like Google, Microsoft, they're like years ahead of anyone else.
Yeah.
Amazon is also very, very strong.
I mean, the platform providers are fueling it, aren't they? Because they're providing these machine learning algorithms that you can use. So I think Apple certainly has been pushing machine learning, designing it into their chips and so forth. But maybe we should take a step back and just define what is data science. We should do that probably before we go any further.
That's a great question. Yeah, sometimes when I run presentations, when I run workshops, that's the question I like to ask my audience: what is data science? And you see some people are like, like that's so interesting. Like everyone's talking about it, not many people can define it, and that's the same thing with many, with many difficult concepts, right? So it's, I think you see this a lot across maybe the centuries. This sounds too big, but it's true. It's like sometimes science, there are like concepts and words created in science, and then society uses them, but they don't really understand them. I'd say that, if we look 60, 70 years in the past, probably physics was the most popular, let's say, science. Everyone abused, and they still abuse energy. Energy in physics is quite well defined, but people are like, oh, energy this and energy that and whatever. These days, computer science is the most popular science. People abuse all kinds of concepts, and, so the thing with data science is that it gets confused a lot with AI and machine learning. And really, data science is just an umbrella term which is used to bring together many different fields which showed up over the last 200 years with similar goals, either to analyze data or to replicate human intelligence. And people started using this term to unify all these efforts and also make it easier to sell, really, to sell services. So AI is actually more academic work, because this was the original discipline, let's say 1956 in Carnegie Mellon. This is where it was born, and at Dartmouth College as well, and IBM. These were the three main players. And then machine learning is basically one approach to AI, which has been popular since the 90s, and it's by far the most popular approach. And deep learning is a subset of AI, but I think data science helps bring everything together. I guess as the industry becomes more familiar with data science, you'll hear the word AI, the term AI being used more and more. Simply because it just sounds cooler, really. This pisses many researchers off, but I've personally come to accept as a fact of life that this is how the world works, through buzzwords and jargon.
But what is the shortest definition for data science? If you had like an elevator that is where the cables have been cut and it's plummeting down the shaft, and someone says, what is data science? Then how would you define it before you hit the ground?
I think I won't have enough time to answer this question, because the way I define it, when at least that's what I say in my workshops, is to simply use data to do useful stuff. That's just it, because if you break it down and you see like all its constituent parts and all the different fields, that's basically the common thread. I
love it. That is a fantastic definition. I would die feeling happy that I learned something today. Bang.
Your very last moment.
So, but it encompasses all those things that you mentioned: artificial intelligence, and this is like the Russian doll. You peel the artificial intelligence out, it seems like machine learning is a subset of that, and deep learning is a subset of that. But then we have statistics as well, which I guess sits alongside it. But that sort of orientates us. And back to my establishing set of questions. So Decision Makers Handbook to Data Science is aimed at decision makers. Who do you think of as decision makers? Is it just CEOs or?
So decision maker can be anyone from a solo entrepreneur to a manager within a bigger organization, or or this doesn't have to be upper management. This can also be someone who's influential within a group within an organization. So I've worked like with entrepreneurs, with startups, with scale-ups, and I've also worked sorry, with let's say people who were in an analytics team and they were planning to expand, and they were just looking to understand a bit better how they could transition from simple analytics to AI machine learning. So data science, the decision maker in this case is like the broad definition of a decision maker.
Yeah.
And obviously, someone could also talk about politics, etc. But my book is not so much for the public sector; it's more for companies.
Yeah, so there's many decision makers, especially nowadays in companies where we're supposed to be empowering them. Then it gets flatter and flatter, and hopefully we have almost all of us are decision makers in some ways in a company that really empowers its workers. I was kind of jealous when I looked at the fact. So we have the same publisher, A-Press, and my book, Beacon Technologies. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Ecosystem. I've got to plug my book. Is a lot less readable than your book because your book is like approximately 150 pages, and mine started off as 700, and then they used a bigger book format, and that got it down to 500. And I realized, so I want to compliment you because it's very readable, and it really pulls you into this. And it seems like one of the questions I had was, what changed between the first edition and the second edition that has just come out?
Oh, there were a few more use cases and a few more tools at the end of the book, which helps decision makers to implement data science. I mean, I wanted to make the book very readable and not long on purpose because I'm like, if you're a decision maker, you're looking for information, not for something to read, while you're on holiday. So this was done on purpose. It's for the same reason that every time I was running workshops, I was trying to be efficient.
Yes.
It wasn't so much as it wasn't like a 2-week session. It was like a day session. My next book is going to be longer. It's about 100,000 words, but that's more for the general public, that just wants to read the book to learn more about data science and also pass the time.
Yeah, it struck me. I mean, there was a lot of, you make it very practical, so you kind of bring it back to nuts and bolts of businesses. And you do consulting as well. Is that, how much did your consulting kind of inform the book?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm also running a company that helps businesses and helps individuals design the right data strategy, and not just data strategy. It handles all the soft parts of data science, like culture, hiring, etc. And basically this book was based on the work that I had done with the Tesseract Academy over the last 2-3 years or so. Right? So it was based on my workshops, the conversations I had. So it's like the best parts, the most useful parts for a decision maker.
Interesting.
And then also consult, but yeah. Sorry?
Yeah, no, that's interesting that it came from that. My book came from the same place. I was consulting and training people. And I'm like, really need to write this stuff down. And then it just ballooned. But you've kept it to a point where people can really absorb it and get a lot out of it. That one of the pet peeves I have, it's, when something's successful, maybe it's because I grew up in England, and whenever something's successful, then I immediately look at it with suspicion. And data science has been very successful. And one of the responses that I hear entrepreneurs talking about is, yes, we're going to make money on the data. We've got to accumulate as much data as we can. It's all about the data, and which is fine, I guess. But it's also kind of frustrating because there seems to be a lack of ability to answer the second question, which is, well, what is this data going to be used for? And so how do you see the same thing? Are people just like jumping on the data bandwagon And how do they get in trouble? How do people get in trouble? Maybe this is a better question. How do people get in trouble when they try and pursue data as a key part of their entrepreneurial business strategy?
I mean, there are many ways someone can get in trouble when they try to adopt data science. One of the ways this happens is to not having a data strategy in place and just accumulating data and then be like, oh, I'm going to deal with this later once, I get a data scientist to do it for me. This is where usually things go wrong when you realize that the data is not in the right format, the right variables are not there, etc., etc. I'd say data science, I mean, it's good to be skeptical, but I'd say data science had a long time to prove itself because, statistics as a discipline has been around for 200 years or so. So it's like, and then we had AI and machine learning, and now it's being used in so many different things. So it's not like data science came out of the blue. I think it had a long time to prove itself. But there's still some people who are skeptics. I mean, even in the industry. Yeah, I'd say it's different than cryptocurrencies, which have only started to prove themselves very recently.
Yeah, I'm definitely not arguing that there's nothing there. The examples you cited at the beginning are proof that there's value. The thing that I object to is just kind of an adoption of it without the realistic, well-aligned goals and having thought through beyond it's all about the data. I kind of feel like blockchain's a little bit like that. It sort of gets the technology a bad name when people don't do it well, and there's kind of failures because of that. And maybe the answer is just to buy your book. I thought one of the really interesting sections is you talk about how to lie with statistics. So I think maybe I'm not capturing that as well. But you had a great example of showing this correlation between. Or maybe you can remind me. There's a film star and their habits, and help me out here. How to lie with statistics.
Yes, I mean, yeah, there are many ways to lie with statistics or data. The problem with, let's say, the data science, the problem with statistics is that these methods from these disciplines, they're used to make up stories because data is always interpreted and communicated. And there's some degree of arbitrariness, not in every case, but in many cases. And I think you see this a lot in economics, in finance, in politics, in election polling. And there's just many ways to do this, right? I'd say graphs is the most obvious way to do this. I think graphs lie all the time. It's just the way things are. But you also see more subtle ways of doing this. Like in research, for example, sometimes you see tests which maybe they're using the wrong way, this sort of things. And sometimes lying with statistics can be purely intentional, as you might see it happens in, again in politics a lot, but sometimes it's unintentional, as you might see in research. For example, sometimes you see research in medicine, biology, and there might be some subtle issues with the methods used, and it's just very difficult to, detect this unless someone actually is really looking for them. It's just the way things are. It's good to be a bit cautious about every new technology, every new shiny thing, and I think it's good to, it's good to be optimistic. But one of the worst mistakes you can make with technology is to believe that you're immune to error because you're using some kind of new fancy technology. And data science can often give to someone a false, let's say, perception of being, invulnerable, of being impossible to make a mistake because you're using this new fancy method. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is, when you see some decision makers who think that it's only human judgment that can work.
Go with your gut, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think both extremes are not very good,
Okay. I found it in your book, so I'm going to help myself out here. So what you do is you correlate the number of people drowning in swimming pools with the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in, and you show the graph, which shows a real correlation between Nicolas Cage driving the drownings in swimming pools, which I thought was very funny. Which obviously, just to make it clear, you're not actually saying that Nicolas Cage is killing people. That's just an illustration of this.
There's a website dedicated to this, basically. There's a website dedicated to this that finds funny correlations and it presents them. And it's all this kind of, like, for example, how many, how much butter is consumed in, I don't know, in Arizona, and that correlate with how many people die of skiing accidents in Switzerland, like totally insane things. But this is funny until you realize that the same thing might have actually caused the financial crisis. I mean, it wasn't the only reason, but for example, if you work in finance and you're trying to find, you're doing portfolio optimization and you're trying to find series which are correlated or uncorrelated, then you might come up with all kinds of good relationships, because if you have thousands and thousands of time series, eventually you're going to stumble upon some patterns which are purely accidental, right? Just like looking at the clouds and believing you see some kind of form, so this can actually happen. This is what I want to say. And there was this argument by some statisticians saying that this partly caused a crisis, because you had people who were using these models and they were detecting all kinds of correlations in time series which weren't there, and eventually this made the models weaker. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated because there are also many other factors in play around subprime mortgages, etc. But it just shows you that when you have domain knowledge about a problem, it's clear that what they're suggesting, that Nicolas Cage and suicides or whatever are connected is clearly an insane proposition. But if you're talking about physical phenomena, financial time series, it's just very difficult to have this kind of insight, to know whether these correlations really exist. And medicine is like a prime example. It's like I think many people can relate to this, like, in medicine and also in things around medicine, like supplements and health and fitness. People have all these anecdotal stories, all these stats, and all these weird correlations. It's very difficult to find out what's true and what's not. Nutrition is a field I like a lot, very much. I think it's very important that every 10 years they basically rewrite the book, I guess. And that's part of, because there are many issues with the methodology they're following.
But how do you prove the negative? So it's easy to put the graph up of suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation, and US spending on science, space, and technology. And I'm sure at some point there's been a congressional hearing where someone has tried to do that. But other than the fact that it's ludicrous, is there any way that you can scientifically prove that they're not related? Or is it just a matter of challenging it and saying, well, show me why they're related?
It's not easy. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, it's difficult to disconnect statistics and data science from domain knowledge, right? So you do need to have domain knowledge when you are working with data science. So you can't really automate everything and say, I'm just going to throw numbers into a machine and something will come out of it. Because data science statistics, they deal with models, and models are simplifications of the world, right? When we started talking, I mentioned that I realized during my PhD days that when I was working with Tottenham Hotspur, that being a data scientist quite often is much more than just handling data, and you have to handle the culture. You need to have the knowledge about the organization you're working for, etc. And this just and you can't really separate these two elements, unless of course you're in some domains where let's say the problem stays stable, right? So if, for example, your computer vision, you know that animals, humans, they more or less stay the same over the millennia. But if you're talking about, societies and anything where, you have multiple moving pieces, then it's just tougher. I mean, then again, there are like various there are techniques around statistical significance, etc., to prove whether sometimes correlations exist or this or that. But then it gets very technical. Let's say if you need to resort to super complicated arguments, and there's something that common sense says. It's like, quite often, like, data follow common sense and domain knowledge. So if you have like data telling you that something which seems totally crazy is happening, then you need to re-examine your assumptions and then maybe find other ways to study it. I mean, one of the most common examples being this paradox. I can't remember the name, with mothers that are smoking and the babies, that says that the mothers that are smoking, there's a smaller probability of the babies uh, dying. I think the first year or something like this, from a serious disease. And essentially, what I mean, that's like a probabilistic model which explains why this happens. But essentially, the thing is that you have this model where you have either babies that have some kind of disease, and then you have some mothers that are smoking. And if a mother is smoking, it's unlikely that she's smoking and she also has the disease. So it was birth weight, low birth weight, yeah. So if for example a baby is born with low birth weight and the mother is smoking, then essentially it was less unlikely for the mother to be smoking and the baby to also have the disease.
Yes.
And it's a bit of a complicated argument, but if you see like how the model breaks down and the equations, then it kind of makes sense. But when you see this in real life, it looked as if smoking protects babies, from dying from some serious disease.
Yeah.
So this is what I was trying to get to. And it was really basically a side effect of how, everything is organized.
Got it. So you talk about data management in the book. I think it's worth explaining to people what data management is. Could you do
that? Sure. So data management is about creating a strategy, yeah, and then following up with the strategy and iterating upon it and improving it as to how you can collect data, store data, manipulate data in order to extract value for your business. And I'm talking about data management from a decision maker's perspective. I'm not talking about, whether you should use MongoDB or some other database, because it's, because in my book, I want to take a decision maker's perspective, and, the technologies, they change all the time. So you have new databases and new trends and new versions, but the sound principles of data management do not really change. Okay, and I think the principles of data management might be similar to principles in other areas of business. That's why I focus a lot on use cases and on checklists and things that someone needs to keep an eye on, like, for example, data quality, whether you're collecting data with some particular use case in mind, which can guide you later on. Essentially, data management is a lot about avoiding this situation we talked about earlier, which is like, I'm just going to collect data and, I'll figure it out along the way, which is it's a recipe for disaster, right? It's just like going to the gym and saying, I'm going to work out and I'm just going to do random stuff and to eat random stuff and we'll just figure it out along the way, and then you wonder why you're not losing weight.
Right. I also want to talk a bit about data quality. Those of us who spent time on the data warehousing, analytics side know that dirty data is just, it's a very challenging problem. And I think there's a lot of tools that have been put in place to clean it up. But how do you keep data clean? Is there a formula for if a decision maker wants to keep their data tidy? How can they do that?
So I think tidy data, there are a few different things someone can do. First of all is try to document their approach, to document what they're basically where the data is coming from, what the variables represent, etc., which doesn't happen that often. Data needs to be centralized in some manner, so you don't have different people, different groups having different data sets. That's very important. Then it's very important, and finally, it's important to have some kind of standard which is going to assist with some kind of implementation. So if, for example, you know that you want this data to build, let's say, a recommender system, then you're going to also start think about what the variables should look like, what variables you need, etc. If you just like storing data in an arbitrary way, then you'll end up in a situation where you're going to have to spend significant amount of time in order to fix the problems with this data, right? I think, these are the main points about the dirty and tidy data, at least the ones that come to my mind right now.
Very good. And I thought it was interesting that you look at this subject also from an organizational perspective in terms of how to hire and keep good data scientists. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think one key thing with data science these days is that it's still in high demand skill set, and pretty much like all workers in tech, right? And you want to make sure that you lay the foundation before you hire someone, and you can also then keep them happy. So by laying the foundation, I mean that if you've taken the steps to build the right data strategy, if you've taken the steps to you build a data strategy, you have the right culture, you have some interesting problems to solve, a data scientist will find this environment much more stimulating and rewarding, rather than if you just have a bunch of data lying around and this person will have to spend 6 months fixing this data. Yeah, so that's one. And then I think, so I'd say actually this is very important, maybe the most important factor compared to other tech workers, because a developer might be called upon to build something from the ground up, but the data scientists, they don't really enjoy, for example, data manipulation that much. They enjoy the actual modeling part. So that's why I've heard some like horror stories, like, companies hiring people and 2 months later, these people basically resign because they have nothing to do, there was no data. And then obviously, there are other things which are pretty standard in tech now. We see lots of flexible working, which I think COVID will help. Like everyone post-COVID thinks that this is here to stay. Yeah, I guess these are the basics. Then it really depends on the person. But yeah, I mean, if I could give one advice to a decision maker, be it a company owner or a manager or whatever, it would be, lay the foundation first, right? So don't just hire some very smart, motivated, highly paid professionals and expect them to do all like the difficult and boring work because you didn't really take care of this earlier on. It's very easy for them to get demotivated and just find a better job.
Yeah. So that's actually a key competency is actually finding good ones and keeping good data scientists. And I think reading your book is going to be helpful in doing that. Well, I know you're super busy, so we're coming up to the top of the hour. Thank you very much for spending time with us. And I think it's really one bit of data science that it's really well developed is the art of search engines. So all people need to do is search for Decision Makers Handbook to Data Science, and they're going to find you and this book. So congrats, well done, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very happy to be here.